Have you ever stopped to think about how a language spoken on just one little island ended up becoming a global force? Well, today we're diving into the incredible journey of English and how it grew from just a few million speakers to almost 2 billion. Okay, let's start with a number. Back in the late 1500s, this was roughly how many people spoke English. Somewhere between 5 and 7 million. And get this, every single one of them lived right there within the British Isles. Now let's jump forward about 400 years. Today, that number has just exploded. We're talking an estimated 2 billion people. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 1 out of every 3 people on the planet who can communicate in English in some way. The growth is just astronomical. So this incredible leap from a few million to a few billion, well, it makes you wonder, right? Who are all these people? Are they all native speakers, people who grew up with English from day one? The answer is probably not what you think. So here's the breakdown. We've got about 330 million native speakers, or what we call L1 speakers. But look at this. They're actually outnumbered by the 430 million plus people who speak English as an official second language, or L2. And honestly, that's probably a low estimate. So what's the big takeaway here? It's that non-native speakers are now the majority. Let's just quickly make sure we're on the same page with those terms. L1, that's your first language, your mother tongue. Simple enough. But L2 is a bit different. It's a second language that has an official status in a country, maybe for things like government or school. And that difference is absolutely crucial for understanding how English spread the way it did. You see, this massive expansion, it didn't just happen randomly. It was really driven by 2 major historical waves, or what linguists like to call the 2 great dispersals. And this really shows the 2 completely different paths the language took. First, you have the first diaspora. This was all about native English speakers migrating, moving to new places and setting up new communities. This is how we got new mother tongue varieties, like American or Australian English. But then you have the second diaspora. Totally different story. This was driven by colonization, and it set up English as an official second language across Asia and Africa, creating what we now call the New Englishes. All right, so let's dive into that first wave. This was all about huge migrations. People from England, Scotland, and Ireland packing their bags and taking their language with them to start new lives somewhere else. And you can see how it played out right here. It all kicks off in North America, right? The first permanent settlement in Virginia in 1607, then the Puritans showing up in New England, then, more than a century later, the whole thing goes global, reaching way down into the southern hemisphere with the colonization of Australia and New Zealand. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The folks who moved didn't all sound the same. For instance, the settlers in Virginia, they mostly came from the west of England, a place where people pronounce their R's like in car. But the people who settled New England, they were from the east, where that R sound was already starting to disappear. So these different dialects all got thrown into a blender, they evolved, borrowed words from local languages, and eventually gave us the distinct accents we hear today. Okay, so that's the first wave. Now let's switch gears and look at the second one, because this is a totally different kind of story. This phase wasn't about lots of English speakers moving. Nope, this was about the expansion of colonial power. And Africa is a really powerful example of how this worked. In West Africa, English came in through the slave trade. This led to new, mixed languages, pidgins and creoles, that people created just so they could communicate. But in East Africa, it was a different story. Large-scale British settlement meant that English was basically installed from the top down, right into big institutions like the government and the school. Meanwhile, over in South Asia, a single policy paper had this monumental effect. It was called the Macaulay Minute of 1835, and it basically argued for setting up an English-language school system in India. That one decision ended up cementing English's role there for generations, not just as a language for government, but as the language of the educated. And the result of that one policy? Well, by 2003, it was estimated that India alone had around 200 million second-language English speakers. Think about that. A single nation now has one of the largest English-speaking populations in the world. And it's a direct legacy of that second diaspora. But of course, a global spread that's so closely tied to colonial power, well, it leaves behind a pretty complicated and controversial legacy. It kicked off this huge, long-lasting debate about power, about prestige, and about what it even means to speak proper English. You see, this history really forces us to confront a pretty fundamental question, one that people are still arguing about today. Are all of these new global forms of English actually created equal? And that attitude was just perfectly captured in this quote from 1995 when Britain's Prince Charles called American English very corrupting. I mean, wow. His comment really gets to the heart of this old school prescriptivist idea that some versions of English, usually British English, are somehow purer or better than all these new varieties popping up around the world. So when you boil it all down, the story of English isn't really just about the numbers or the maps. It's about a living, breathing debate about identity, about power, and about who really gets to own a language that now, for better or worse, belongs to the whole world. And that kind of leaves us with one final big thought to chew on. As English keeps changing and adapting in every corner of the globe, who gets to be the referee? Who gets to decide what's proper or correct English in the 21st century?